Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's X Camera Talk. My name is Hannah Gardner. Thank you very much for being here with us today. So first, I'd like to welcome everyone here. The X Camera series began in the spring of 2019 when a group of people interested in the arts gathered at Fresh Ground Cafe / Commons Studio in downtown Kitchener every Friday afternoon until March of 2020 to hear a lecture by an interdisciplinary artist or professional. The lectures were followed by a question and answer period, and then time for people to stay in the cafe space, to eat lunch together, continue conversations, and build a community. So it's in this spirit of supporting artists and building community that X Camera has been relaunched virtually on Zoom. The series will continue on Fridays at 1 for the foreseeable future. So today we're doing things a bit differently. We've invited two emerging artists to the talk, Manahil Bandukwala and Jordan Blackburn, who will each give us a short lecture on their work. So first we'll have Manahil, and then we'll go to Jordan. Following that, we will open up, we'll begin with a question and answer period for both of the artists. And then after that, at around 2 o'clock, we'll open up the room. So if you're able to stay past that, we encourage you to do so, to introduce yourselves, let us know what you've been working on or what you intend to work on. So we'd like the space to be open for discussions about potential future collaborations as well. So please share your ideas if you'd like. We're very pleased to have Manahil and Jordan with us here today. And we would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the neutral, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis peoples. We recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land. The Dish with One Spoon covenant is a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and to the earth. We should only take what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, work, and learn. I'll now hand it off to Isabella Stefanescu, who will introduce the artists. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Lunchtime X Camera. I'm glad that you all showed up. And my name is Isabella Stefanescu, and I've been working with Interarts Matrix since 2007. This series, X Camera, is curated by Sheila McMath, who is the artistic director of Interarts Matrix, and it's supported by operating grants from the cities of Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge, and by project grants from the Ontario Arts Council and the Ontario Trillium Foundation. I'm very pleased to welcome today two young artists. First of all, Manahil Bandukwala, who is a writer, editor, and visual artist from Pakistan and is currently based in Mississauga. She's the author of 4 poetry chapbooks, 2 of which are collaborative with Conyer Clayton, and she's currently coordinating editor for Art Poetry magazine and digital content editor for Canthius. She is in the process of completing her MA in English at the University of Waterloo. So her presentation is going to be about 20 minutes, and it's going to be followed by a presentation from Jordan Blackburn, who is a Franco-Albertan artist based in Trois-Rivières with a BFA from NASCAD and recently an MFA from the University of Waterloo. Informed by experience and practice-based research, his work considers complex relationships between humans and nature and uses visual storytelling to navigate cultural aspects of a worsening ecological crisis. His work has been shown both nationally and internationally. He has received a number of awards for his research, including the Joseph Armand Bombardier Canadian Graduate Scholarship. So please welcome them, Manahil, Jordan, and afterwards, about the 45-minute mark, we'll ask some questions. You can ask the questions in chat to address them to panelists and audience so everybody can see them. You can also ask your questions if you're a shy nature in the Q&A, where you can ask anonymous questions. Although we prefer to know who asks these questions. And if you want to ask your questions in person and you can stay beyond 2 o'clock, we shall open up the room to see who is here and you can ask your question in person. Thank you, and Manahil, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction, Isabella. As she mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Reth or Reghistan, which is an interdisciplinary project that I started with my sister in about 2019, and it explores folklore from Pakistan and puts it into contemporary context through poetry and sculpture. I have some images that I'll be sharing throughout the presentation. So I'm just going to put that up right now. Okay. So the name Reth or Reghistan literally translates into sand and desert, which are two features of the landscape of the city of Karachi, which is where I grew up, and it's in the province of Sindh. So these stories come from a desert and coastal region. The project kind of started out with Nimra and I collecting twigs and flowers and rocks on hikes and making miniature worlds in teacups and old books with the materials that we found. And now it's blossomed into an ongoing project that blends our different interests and skill sets. Currently, where the project is at is that we have a manuscript of about 20 stories, 20 poems, and about 40 miniature sculptures. So growing up, we loved making crafts with found materials like shells, cloth, and really anything we could get our hands on. And when we first started making miniature worlds, we used things that we'd found on hikes around the GTA in our backyard in Mississauga. And we made scenes from Lord of the Rings, like the Shire that's up on the screen right now, and Harry Potter. And after making a few of these worlds that were based on Western stories, we thought that it would be a lot of fun to sculpturally depict stories from our own culture. But when we tried to think of what stories we'd want to depict, we realized that we couldn't think of any in enough detail that we could kind of render them through this medium. And that started our interest in researching into folklore from the area where we grew up. And around the time that we were brainstorming what exactly we wanted Reth or Reghistan to look like, including what we wanted the name to be, Nimra came across a grant that funded research for cultural projects. And right now, I just want to talk a little bit about applying to grants as an emerging artist, because the project our research has been funded, we've been able to pay ourselves, and that is really huge and amazing to do as an emerging artist. So something that we learned about applying to grants that give thousands of dollars in funding is that they really want your proposal to be as detailed and specific as possible. We had to think about what we wanted the outcomes and our tangible final product to be. It wasn't enough to say we want to make sculptures out of stories. It was how many, how would they be displayed or exhibited, and things like that, and how are the goals of our project achievable. One thing to note is that we did not get this first grant, but writing the application forced us to kind of flesh out our project in a way that we might not have done otherwise. We had to narrow down our scope from where we'd proposed traveling across all of Pakistan and collecting stories, but that was just way out of our capabilities. So we narrowed it down to stories from Sindh, and that worked out a lot better for the project. We applied for a second grant and didn't get that one. But the third grant we applied for with the Canada Council for the Arts was the one that was finally successful. And that kicked our project off. So we were able to pay for flights to Pakistan, research trips, pay ourselves for the time that we put into the project, and also pay the people that we interviewed. We then applied for subsequent grants to fund the writing and sculptural process once we were back in Canada. And one of the key factors that helped us was advice that we'd received from people who'd been successful with grants, most notably for the initial stages of this project. A colleague who I worked with on some literary projects read over our application, gave a lot of great feedback. And one thing was, this is before the project just really had anything to it, but she gave us a lot of confidence that it was something that we should pursue and it was worthwhile and interesting, which I think when you're working alone by yourself as an artist is a little harder to see. She advised calling up funding officers, which was intimidating to do, but really helpful because they guided us in phrasing parts of the application to ensure that we wrote about how our project met the grant's goals. And diving into this alone, I would not have had a clue of what to do, but having someone to answer questions, no matter how small those questions were, was really, really helpful. And this is just something that I wanted to talk about, like, to other artists in the same boat, looking to kind of see how to make careers out of art. Yeah, and now I'm going to talk a bit about the actual kind of research and creative outputs that we did with the project. So we have a website, sculpturalstorytelling.com, where we've kind of shared what the project is about and have also shared what our research process was like, who we interviewed, places that we went. And one of the most fascinating things that I learned during this research and didn't know before at all was that stories of Sindh were stories that very likely took place in real life. So thinking about kind of Western fairy tales that we're familiar with, like Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood, is that they're really embedded in the supernatural and fantastical. But these stories that we were looking at in Sindh, most of the figures that appear in the stories have grave sites across the province. There's architectural sites and archaeological sites that we can visit. So the one up on the screen right now is Umercote Fort, which is where the story of Umar and Marvi took place. And it's in the city of Umercote. And when we went to visit, the people who live in that city are really kind of embedded and still influenced by the story and kind of the lessons that we learn from it. We also visited this archaeological site in Pambor, which is where the story of Sassi and Pannu took place. And in the story, the setting that's described is of the village being a washer village. And the kind of rings that you see in the ground here are where they put the clothes in and wash them in there. So it's really interesting to see how these features of the stories are still here today, and we can kind of experience what the characters in the story would have, how they would have experienced the environment around them. And in the case of our exploration with Reth or Reghistan, how the desert landscape and the features of that influenced their behavior. These stories are ones that are passed down orally, and they're shared through songs, so multiple versions of the same stories exist. A really interesting thing about talking to different people was that each person had different details to share, and we learned how elements of the narrative changed as people's priorities changed. This experience and realization during our fieldwork really helped Nimra and I understand the reality of the phrase, history is written by the victors. So if history is kind of a distilled collection of stories that was handpicked and filtered, and what we know is very curated, then folklore is more of a pool of abundant and overlapping remembered pasts from kind of the everyday person, which in a way can make folklore a truer, more relevant version of history, and has made this project just really kind of eye-opening for us to undertake. Once we were back in Canada, we'd kind of done all this research, visited these sites, and had this raw data that we then had to synthesize into something that we understood and could turn into the poetry and sculpture that we wanted to do. We collected materials during field visits. So from Pambor, we got the guide kind of gave us pottery that the archaeologists there didn't need. We collected shells from the beach. We found bits of bone around. And then in our house in Karachi, we had tons of old cloth and wedding cards that we repurposed into our project. As we were living in folklore world, as we called it, we began turning our research into a manuscript. And in our manuscript, each story has 3 components: our telling of the story, a poem, and 2 photographs of miniature sculptures. And I want to share an example of what this story, poem, sculpture looks like. So I'm going to share an excerpt from the manuscript, which is the story of Nuri. And I have a photograph up of the sculpture that I'll talk about once I've shared the story. So we've titled this one Feast of Fish Bones. So Nuri was from a fishing village near Conyer Lake in Thatta, which is along the Sindh coast. She grew up in this very vibrant and close-knit community. And one day, John Tamachi, who was at the time the ruler of Thatta, went hunting in the woods near Conyer Lake, and he rested in Nuri's village for the night. While there, he and Nuri met and had this kind of instant connection. And by the time he was ready to leave, John Tamachi asked Nuri to marry him. So Nuri left her village and she went to Thatta and lived in the palace as John Tamachi's 7th wife. And that time was very common for kings to kind of have multiple wives. In the palace, Nuri was surrounded by wealth, which was very, very different from the kind of life that she lived in the village, which was just described as very simple and kind of met their needs, but was not excessively luxurious. So while in the palace, Nuri was not interested at all in any of the luxuries, any of like the comfortable clothes or beds or any of that. Her attitude to all of this made John Tamachi fall more and more in love with her. And this arose jealousy in the king's other wives. They constantly thought of ways to discredit Nuri in John Tamachi's eyes. In a lot of the tellings of this story, actually, it goes on about all the ways that the wives kind of tried to discredit Nuri and get rid of, the tricks that they want to play on her. But the one that's persisted and is kind of the most common across multiple tellings is how one day they hatched a plan to make the king think that Nuri was stealing money from the palace. And they did this because every night Nuri would go to the palace gardens and give her brother a wooden box. The king's wives told the king that the box was full of jewels and Nuri was stealing from the palace. But the king was quite confused at this because Nuri, who kind of turned her back at all the luxuries, why would she steal from the palace? So he went and he caught her brother entering one night and demanded that he show him the contents of the box. Jamtamachi opened the box and found it full of fish bones and scraps of bread. Bewildered but relieved, he asked Nuri about it the next day. And Nuri said that she didn't want to get used to eating the kind of luxurious food of the palace. She didn't want to lose her taste for her mother's food and for her village's food. So this is an example of how the wife schemes just always ended in Jamtamachi's love and respect for Nuri growing even more. Nuri left her legacy in Teta and in her village. When she died, the king buried his beloved wife in the middle of Conyer Lake, which is the village where she grew up. The small white tomb is still there today. And when Nimra and I were visiting the area, we talked to a woman who's from the same jut as Nuri, and she told us that every year when the tide is low enough, they row out to the tomb and they sprinkle flowers on Nuri's grave, and they kind of sit in the same space as this woman whose legacy has really lingered. It was really interesting just hearing about how people held this figure in so much importance, and how Nuri, who may have lived 700 years ago, still kind of has her presence and life in the space today. So that was the story of Nuri, and I kind of, based on the conversations that we had, particularly with the women we spoke to who talked about going out to the grave, I wrote a poem that kind of looks at what it means to remember and hold on to these legacies. A village remembers. Every August for 700 years, monsoon rains have come. And when they come, they wash up fish bones and bread scraps in Conyer Lake. Sweetwater knows the woman who lies in its middle, feeds her a feast, like a brother brings a sister. Every August, the lake rises. Some shrines sit atop hills to test the strength of pilgrims' legs. Others are in deserts to see how far they'll go. And this one lies in the middle of the lake to see how much a village can swim. Fish find themselves swallowed and spit out by crocodiles and make their offerings. A city chokes itself into amnesia, but a village remembers to set out coarse bread and a day. Sails out to a tomb in the middle of the lake and tells stories of the time Nuri went on a date with the king without so much as a necklace, or when she moved her pillow outside so she could sleep on sand, looking up at the waning crescent moon. So Nimra and I, while I was working on this writing, we worked on our miniature sculptures together. We laid out in our living room all the materials that we'd collected in Pakistan and Canada and began brainstorming ideas of what scenes, characters, and motifs we wanted to depict for each story. For Nuri's sculpture, this one was actually the first sculpture that we made. We wanted to contrast the luxury of the palace with Nuri's personality, since that was something that had just repeatedly been emphasized with all the people we talked to. For scale, Nuri's big enough to fit in the palm of my hand. The throne in the background is probably like as big as my hand span. The throne and the materials that go into making this also carry a lot of stories. So the throne, the lace is made from wedding outfits. Nuri's kameez is one that I remember my mom having a shalwar kameez in that exact print. And so the cloth is probably just scraps of that fabric left over for us to make something out of. The little thread on her plate is just, I think, some kind of seed that we collected on a hike. So we're bringing together all of these materials from different places, and that's really fun to do and really fun to see how each material carries its own story, and it kind of comes together to depict another story. We're layering stories within stories. And making sculptures with found materials means that we never go into our sculptural process knowing what the final product will look like. We see what materials we have, kind of see what we can make out of them. For some of the sculptures, we collected materials from places where the stories took place, so the pottery or shells, for example. But in a lot of cases, there weren't really materials to pick up and bring back. So we're kind of infusing stories from different parts of the world into this one scene. And in the 2 years, I think maybe now, 2.5 years since we started the project, we've brought our research together into a full manuscript that is out with publishers now. When we were back in Canada, Nimra lived in Mississauga. I was studying in Ottawa. So even before COVID, a lot of this project was entirely virtual. We made sculptures in the pockets of time when I went to Mississauga to visit, but a lot of the writing was just drafts that were passed back and forth over Google Docs. Seeing the project through required a lot of dedication. The grants were, one, obviously nice because we were able to pay ourselves for our art, but they also kept us accountable to following through with the project. And having a collaborative partner in general is really great for morale when things seem impossible. And when that collaborator is your sister, it means you have decades of experience crafting together and knowing how to communicate. And just the last thing I want to say before I close off is that we received a lot of support from friends and family along each stage of the project, without which I don't know how much of Reth or Reghistan would have been possible. Working in any field is tough, but a strong community really makes all the bumps in the road seem not all that bad. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed. If you want to see more about the project, you can go to sculpturalstorytelling.com.
Thank you so much, Manahil. I'm sure everybody has a lot of questions. I know that I do, but we'll hold on to the questions. However, if you're really burning to ask your questions, you can type them in the chat. And meanwhile, we'll have Jordan tell us about his work. Thank you.
Hello. I feel like I've been invisible this whole time. I suppose I have been. Everyone has. So I psychologically struggle with not seeing anybody during these presentations, but I'll work with it. Oh, look, Isabella, come to the rescue right away. It's just you and me. I'm going to run a little bit of a video in the background. I was going to run it selectively, but I think I'll just repeat it a couple times while I'm chatting. So I wanted to get a feeling that I was just on a walk with you folks, chatting about this. I thought I'd try this out. So we're going to optimize for video, share the sound, share this screen. And you folks are going for a walk. And you should be able to hear the audio. If anybody finds that the audio is overwhelming my speaking, I can cancel the audio, but if it's okay, then we are beginning our walk in the woods now. So I'll begin by acknowledging that I've spent the past year living and working on the traditional territories of the Atikamekw and the Abenaki peoples to the north and south of the St. Lawrence River, between present-day Trois-Rivières and Eastman, Quebec. As it may be evident in my work, for those of you who are familiar, it's been a great privilege to experience this region since arriving in the spring of 2020. And learning about its long history is going to be a lifelong endeavor. And I'm just very thankful to be here. So my name is Jordan Blackburn, and I recently graduated from the MFA program at the University of Waterloo. And for the past year and a half, I've been living in the province of Quebec while nourishing an interdisciplinary art practice comprised of printmaking and photo and video and sculpture and creative writing. Generally, I consider that the more overlap I'm able to create between these modes of creation, the better. And working with different mediums has offered me the flexibility that I needed to create a body of meaningful work despite numerous challenges that we're all sort of sharing simultaneously. So when I started trying to prepare for this little talk, I found myself feeling concerned about saying the right thing or trying to make sure that you folks, the patient participants and listeners, would leave feeling inspired or enlightened. But the reality of post-grad school life for me at the moment has been quite a mix of questions about what comes next or what I should be doing or what feels good to do right now. And I was asked to share a little bit about my experience as an early career artist. So I'll share a little bit about what's happening currently for me and how I'm responding to it. And then I'd also like to speak a bit about the ways that I'm approaching my work for the past year or so, compared to how I'm trying to think about the work that I'll be making in the future. So right after my degree, I jumped straight into a 2-month contract as a technical assistant at a sculpture studio in Trois-Rivières called Atelier Silex. And it's been around for like 38 years, which is super cool. I'm also a member at the Atelier Presse-Papier, which is a printmaking studio, which has been around for about 40 years, I believe. And something that's really exciting about these two institutions in Conyer, there's been a whole bunch of arts institutions that are coming and going, but they've stuck around, and I speculate that it's because kind of painting collectives or something, it's very easy for people to sort of pack up and move out if things don't go well. But with sculpture, it's very technically heavy. Like there is, like you get involved with a metal shop and a wood shop, and you have all these sort of communal resources that everyone shares. And in printmaking, the same thing. We have litho presses and intaglio presses and all sorts of equipment that everyone shares. And what's really neat in Trois-Rivières is there's a lot of movement, but unlike some of the larger cities, the shops are quite small, and I've had access to the original creators of these studios. So I've had a chance to meet and work alongside a bunch of artists who have really like set the ground for the groundwork for the culture of art in Trois-Rivières. And so, as I was saying before, I jumped straight out of my degree into a contract as a technical assistant at a sculpture studio at Atelier Silex. And it ended up being a really good opportunity for me. It was only for a couple months. I'm technically just finishing it up now. They had a grant to pay, a recent graduate or student to come in, and it ended up being a perfect opportunity for me to stay busy, to stay connected or connect with artists in my new home in Trois-Rivières, and be surrounded by their frenetic artistic energy without needing to continue creating art at a steady pace. I would say the past few months, or for most of the summer, it's been a bit of a time of rest for me. Like trying to take a break from the level of critical thinking that I was engaging in while working on my thesis. And what I've realized is it has been by no means a break in my life, but it's been a break from that. So this talk is sort of coming up as I make those sort of first really serious moves to go back into laying the foundation for my next steps. So I've been really lucky this summer. I was contacted after my thesis exhibition by a gallery in Montreal called Dazabo, and I received a little award from them, and I received an offer to have an exhibition at a gallery in Ontario, and I had an exhibition proposal accepted for Presse Papier here, the print studio, and that's for 2023. And I've essentially just been working on a lot of different things at all times, and as an artist who's trying to make a living off their work, I touch on almost everything. I make accessible little prints. At times I've made some merch, just like a sweater or something. I'm going to restart that video too. I hope everyone's enjoying it. And I'll explain where it is or what it's from pretty soon. But anyway, I've been doing lots of little things just to keep myself busy and, try to stay humble about what it means to be an artist and what it means to make a living as an artist. I used to be nervous that by making saleable art, I might not be taken seriously. And in fact, I was in an artist talk, or not an artist talk, but a studio visit with quite established artist while I was in school. And I remember she actually overtly warned me about, this other side of my art making, the side that appeared to be in conflict with my, fine art side of what I'm doing. And in a sense, I agree that there's a bit of a difference, but at the same time, they're sort of all connected. But I was warned straight up that it made me look like I wasn't a serious artist. And as an artist, that's something I'm trying to push back against a little bit. But I touch on those things. But I also, in the past, have done artist residencies. I've applied for and received grants from the Canada Council for the Arts. I've lived on artist fees from exhibitions. I have survived on awards and all kinds of things like this. But right now, I'm kind of getting back into these next steps. I found a little studio in Trois-Rivières. It's a little collective. And one thing that I've grown very good at over the years that I would say, how would I start saying that? I would say that something that I've been really good at over the years, I've been moving a lot, and I've had a lot of practice kind of establishing myself in new places, and it gets exhausting and it takes a lot of energy, but I try very hard to get involved with the local community the most I can. So instead of finding a little tiny private studio somewhere, I have a little tiny space in a large kind of collective space, and things like this, and things that might not seem so obvious at first, but really make sense. So I'll talk a little bit about where I'm at and my practice. So I consider myself to be Franco-Albertan, but growing up I didn't really speak French, and it's a complicated story to explain why, but the important detail is that I was geographically and linguistically isolated from my family for a large majority of my life. And since arriving in Quebec recently and learning French, I've learned a lot about the history of my family and my inherent implication in the colonization of so-called Canada. And essentially, I've discovered my roots of my personhood. And I've been gradually trying to understand all the wonderful and difficult things that I discovered while digging deeper. When I was growing up in Alberta, I didn't have many familiar connections, whereas here I was visiting a museum that was specifically about logging and forestry in Quebec. And while I was there was an interview being played with an old logger who started name dropping a bunch of really significant families in the forestry industry in Quebec. And one of the names that came up was Blackburn. And I contacted my father and I talked to him about that. And he told me that my grandfather, who ran a dépanneur in a gas station for years and years and years, apparently for years before that, was a full-time forestry guy. Like he was a lumberjack. And these little things have been really, they're coming up all the time, and they're having a big influence on the way that I'm thinking about making work. So growing up, I was distanced from my family, as I said, but I grew up loving to accompany my father on hunts and hikes. We went on modest fishing trips, complete with flooded engines and wet pants and blood and fear and harm and harvest. And I remember I cried the first time I saw the inside of a deer, which I think a lot of people here would probably also cry if they saw the inside of a deer. But I also got to experience the joy of sitting high up in the trees and watching the sun as it rose over bare canopy on frigid mornings of winter in Alberta. And there's a deep part of me that wants to capture this kind of beauty, these little moments, and what we might call the sublime, which is a word that I often need and almost never remember. I don't know exactly why, but I speculate that I've always associated the word with excessive romanticism or grandiosity, at least enough that I've sort of dismissed it from my vocabulary. But I want to get a little closer to the word because I don't think an experience needs to be grandiose or optically overwhelming to be sublime. Like a little stone can offer a sublime experience if we're able to imagine its history before it's found at our feet. I'm also skeptical of the presumption that sublime experiences need to be devoid of human touch. I'm sure not everyone would agree, but I often get the impression that people who are seeking out sublime experiences are looking for a landscape that serves their misconception that nature is something that exists outside of culture, untouched and uninfluenced by human beings. So over the past year, I found myself experimenting with video and poetry, trying to catch these moments, particularly in this area that I've shown you in this video. I'm going to run this other video because it suggested it and it seems appropriate, but it is in a different space. But I think this could be nice to share. So that last video was taken in an area that I would consider to be an uncanny landscape. The audio from this one might be a little too strong, so I don't know if anybody can confirm, but if that turned it down, that is just what I want. So anyway, that past video was taken in a space that I consider to be an uncanny landscape. It was a terrain in the Abenaki territory to the west of Mount Orford, and it's owned by my relatives and surrounded by hundreds of acres of land, dotted with seasonal homes and private lake access. And I changed my mind about this video because I realized it's like totally throwing me off. So I'm going to chalk that one up as a bad decision on my end. But I'll talk about what this is. Maybe I'll just run it with like no sound at all so I can sort of check out. But anyway, so the space is, it's natural, it's unnatural, it's private, it's generally inaccessible. And these spaces are really interesting to me because in ways they sort of defy our impression of what nature is, or I say we and nature and all these things quite generally, but I'm just trying to keep it simple. But what interests me about them is the potential for kind of digging into those histories in a sense. You know, I took a lot of videos on that past property where we saw the walk, and that's out behind my aunt and uncle's place, which is where I landed when COVID landed, and that gave me a place to think and work. And this other video that I'm showing now for my now and then work, which you can see written on my hand in case I spelt it wrong while transferring it to the log. This work took place on property nearby a friend's house and in Quebec, and it's kind of between suburban space and a public landscape. So it ended up being this neat place to work and create this intervention, which intervenes in not a lot, but it's this thing that people can happen upon. So this is to say that I've become increasingly interested in site-specific artworks. This is sort of to talk about where I'd like my work to start going more. I've become increasingly interested in creating site-specific artworks, which are intended to be happened upon. No openings, no announcements, just a surprise to people that might pass by, kind of like graffiti in a way. Like if in Hamilton, Finlay were to vandalize a national park, for example. I'd like to recreate for others the feeling I get when I happen upon new species of birds or witness an intimate interaction between individuals, not including the times I've happened upon couples fooling around in the woods, mostly talking about when I see animals living their lives, which I guess that anyway. There's things I'd like to forget happening upon, but I'd like to reflect the experience of happening upon these surprises that sort of give us pause or make us feel super present. So that interest has left me with a number of questions, which is like, at what point does work like this simply become invasive or take attention away from its surroundings? You know, I want to create these works that kind of highlight or amplify an aspect of the environment that they exist in, the unnatural quality or the natural quality or the supernatural qualities. I was thinking, how do I create the work in a way that acknowledges the historical occupation of the land? I've had questions about whether or not it's important for me to exclusively use materials that already exist in the landscape. So I've thought about, you know, can I create prints or posters and put them in? Can I reflect infrastructure of, you know, guided hikes or interpretive hikes to create sort of a different sort of interpretation? But really what I'm talking about is creating unsanctioned work in nature. And I'm wondering how this work evolves or changes when it's translated into a gallery space as well. So this work that we're looking at here that I'm creating, the Now and Then, this video was played in the gallery, and the photograph of the final work, which I believe should run at the very end of this video, unless I'm mistaken. Totally mistaken. So anyway, you can see it in the title of the X Camera talk, the Now and Then. And essentially, this is something I want to keep working with. And I spend a lot of time when I'm outside and in nature and walking around, sort of making notes of places. And sometimes I take a photo with a geotag so I can return to it, have a little book of sort of notes of places that I'd like to interact with. You know, I've been on hikes where there used to be an interpretive hike, but now there's just these posts that are left over, and I'm really fascinated by them as sort of artifacts or objects or cultural spaces that already exist. So I'm not required to create that cultural space. The sort of infrastructure already exists. I'd like to sort of play with that. So I feel like leaving the talk off there is like kind of a little bit loose, but But yeah, I think those questions are where I'm at for the most part. So I'd be really interested in hearing other people's questions about what I've talked about, or any questions about my experience as an early career artist, or especially I'd like to hear what people think about their thoughts on creating unsanctioned work in natural spaces. So I'll leave it there. Well, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Jordan. And we'll open this to questions. So, first of all, Manahil, you want to come back? And I want to ask you both, do you have questions for each other? Did you know each other before this being in this conversation?
No.
Okay. All right. So, Manahil, Jordan, do you have questions for each other? If not, I have questions for you.
Well, Jordan, I really liked what you said about kind of finding artist residencies in community settings specifically, and was, I don't know, like wondering if you could talk about like how you find those, and I guess how you the risk, I guess, of a community setting is you don't always know like who you're gonna be around and how you can curate like your artistic space, and yeah, just how you do that.
Yeah, I feel like some people have a big old list of like all the residencies, and they sort of just like mass apply to everything. But personally, I'm somebody who's like very, very location specific. I do this with work. I do this with, my whole life. I've never sent out a CV to 10 different places. I've had like 2 places I want to work. Everything else is invisible, and like those, or it's just one place. I'm kind of, to a fault almost, I'm kind of all my eggs in one basket kind of person. So a lot of the places where I've gone to or done residencies at or applied to show work at are places that there's like something about them that draws me to them, or I've heard in my own artistic communities or from friends that, they had an awesome experience in a certain place. For example, if anybody in printmaking is listening, apply to the St. Michael's print shop in St. John's, Newfoundland. They are the coolest people and such an amazing community. So really just things like that, word of mouth and just going with the flow. I'm like a very flowy kind of person. So yeah.
It's very interesting to have both of you, 2 artists who are starting out, working on their first projects outside school, and talking how important it is to keep body and soul together, and the importance of funding. I found that quite fascinating, since it's one of the things that I insist on, actually, that yes, we have to have funding for artists. But there's another aspect of funding that I want to address, especially that you sort of touched on, Manahil, was that in applying for funding, you actually have to articulate a project in a much more detailed way, come up with timelines, budgets, exactly what you want to do. And I wondered whether your experience was that it actually made the project better.
It absolutely did, because when we our initial idea was just, well, we want to research folklore in Pakistan. And that with the grant, we had to think about a set timeline where we'd stay, who we'd interview, how we'd reach out to people to interview, there were a lot of logistics, and having them, even if we didn't stick to each thing specifically, just having a more fleshed out idea was so helpful for us, and also put into perspective for us what was out of scope to do and what was doable, and breaking down the different steps we need to take to reach our goals.
Yeah, thank you.
I liked what you said about sorry to interrupt. Manahil, I liked what you said about the accountability aspect of that. When you get into something and you kind of go like, oh, oh, I really got to pull through on this.
Yeah, like I think it's kind of, I do this a lot with a lot of projects that I start, is you have a lot of energy at the beginning. And when that runs dry and the longer you leave something alone, the harder it is to come back to it.
Mm-hmm.
And with this, it's like, well, the funding body wants an application and they want to actually see what we've done. And if this grant is like something you're using to kind of pay yourself as an artist, you either finish your project or you give the money back.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one is not something you want to do.
With that said, too, I think that like I don't know how many people are listening who are kind of beginning this process too. But I think something to remember as well is that there's accountability to following through with certain commitments, but at the same time, there's often so much time that exists between the proposal of a project and then the actual outcome. Like when you're exhibiting, or when you're applying for funding, sometimes there's like a 1.5 year gap, and sometimes you were in a very different place. And I would assure people that usually there's a lot of flexibility. Your project idea can migrate a lot, but I think the goal is just to not dial it back too much. It's kind of just like shifting it to the side and going forward from there. But there's usually a lot of positive support for changes.
And just to jump in, like calling funding officers before you apply, but also once you've gotten the grant, and any questions you have along the process, and especially just to do with filling out final reports and making those outcomes. There was one grant that we'd applied for to run some events for Reth or Reghistan, and we'd applied before COVID, and we were successful after. And we're just like, we can't run like workshops in person anymore. And we had to effectively change everything we were doing.
Okay.
And we called up the funding officer and talked them through it, brainstormed ideas. So yeah, the people who, a lot of times, the people who run these organizations are really, really helpful.
Yeah, the funding officers are really great resources. I've often found myself asking questions that I've been very, very scared to ask because I think like, oh, I should know this already, or like they're going to put a note in my file that says that I said this thing, but they're completely disconnected.
It's
from
their
the
job
people
to answer your questions. It's
exactly
their job to actually help you.
Yeah.
They're also not the jury.
Exactly.
For the application, which I think I didn't know before applying for grants.